Hey everyone, this is Megan Hillier from Know Your Ancestors, and you're listening to the Know Your Ancestors podcast. Many of us have an innate desire to understand our roots, to know where we come from, and to understand the lives of our ancestors. On the show, I sit down with content creators and entrepreneurs to share some of the stories that I've uncovered and compiled about their own ancestors. Watch and listen as we discuss the traumatic and life-changing events of their close ancestors that helped shape who these guests are today. Hello and welcome to the podcast today. Today is a behind the scenes look at the research that I did for our last episode with Georgette Todd, episode 35, where I shared about her second great grandparents who immigrated from Germany to Hawaii. And I shared with her about her great grandmother, also their daughter. So if you want to go and watch that, go watch the last episode, episode 35, called Fostering Connection with Georgette Todd. But I'm going to talk to you today about using censuses to help build a timeline for your ancestor. So that's kind of what I did in that episode. I used census records to help locate where her ancestors were living, to see where they were on the map, and to see how many people they had living in their family, who they were living with, and all of that. Census records are relatively easy to locate for your ancestors that lived in the United States or Canada after 1850. There are census records in the UK as well for England and Wales, some for Ireland, Scotland. There are some, those two are a little harder to locate. And there's probably census records in other countries as well. But if you had ancestors that lived in the United States after 1850, there are census records that list the head of the household and everyone in that household and their relation to the head of the household. Prior to that, census records started in 1790 that listed the head of the household, and then they had a little tick mark for different age groups and genders that were living in their house. So if you had ancestors that lived in the United States after 1850, census records are a great place to look to get an understanding of where your ancestors lived and who was living with them. Okay, so I'm going to show you how I did this with Georgette and then how you can do this with your own ancestor. Okay, so here is where I found her second great grandparents living in Hawaii in 1900. Okay, so you can see here's H. Helfers, Mina Helfers, and their daughter Matilda. That was her great grandmother. So I found them living in the census here and found her second great grandfather's occupation was overseer at a sugar plantation. Okay. Also on the census page, it provides where they were living. Okay. So in the census, they were living here in Lahui on Kauai. And that shows exactly where they were living. We know that from the census. Okay. Then we know by the time they were in 1910, I found the 1910 census. Now we have Henry and Mina, and Henry is now a policeman at a sugar plantation, and it tells where they lived at Makaweli, which was over here on the island. Okay, so now we have that they lived here, and they moved across the island 10 years later, starting to build that timeline, right? Okay, now by 1920, we see that there's Henry Helfers and Mina Helfers. They were living with their daughter and her husband, okay? And he was now watchman at an auto store. Okay, so now they were living down here on the island of Oahu. So we can say that sometime between 1910 and 1920, they moved from the island of Kauai to Oahu. Okay, by 1930, we see that Henry and Mina were living, their daughter Elsie was living with them. He was a policeman on a sugar farm, and they were now living near Waipahu, just northwest of Honolulu. By 1940, we have Henry and Mina living here. Their grandson is living with them, and their daughter is living next door with their other granddaughter. Okay, and they are living now in Honolulu. Okay, now Mina passed away, and now we have Henry is living with his daughter, Elsie, and he is now listed as widowed. And they are living near the Halawa Trail, just north of Honolulu there. So you can see that just by looking at census records, each of those decades that are available for when they lived in the United States, we see where they lived, his occupation, and who was living in the house with them. So that is a lot of information that you can get just from census records. Now, there's even more on census records if you wanted to dive into them even more. You can see immigration dates, you can see if they were naturalized or not, you can see how much their home was worth, if they had a radio. There's lots of things that you can learn from census records. It just depends on the year what information was recorded. So, maybe you have an ancestor that lived in the United States after 1850. Have you found all the census records for them? If you haven't, you can locate them for free on Family Search, and you can locate some for free on Ancestry, and some are paid. So I'm just going to show you how you can do this for free, and then how you can find information on the census that helps you understand where they lived. Okay, so when you go to Family Search, you can hit on Search and go to Records. Now, I like to search for censuses year by year, okay? You can search for it other ways, but this is how I prefer to do it. So I'm going to show you how to do it this way. Okay, so the first census that was available, the first federal U.S. census that Mina and Henry were living in the United States for was in 1900. So we can either search by 1900 United States. Okay, so we're just going to click on that to see the census. So now we can put his name in, Henry Helfers, and let's just put Hawaii and see what shows up. All right, there's only one H. Helfers that shows up. You might have to play around with the search fields and add more or less information to see what you can find. But now we have this census records for him, and we can take a look at what we can find, right? I showed a clipping of the census as we were browsing through, but when we look at the actual image, we can see all the things that we can see on this 1900 census. Okay, so if we scroll in, first at the top, it tells us where the census was taken. So it's in the Lihue district in Kauai. Okay, sometimes it will have the name of a city, just depends on where it was. Okay, so then we can zoom in and try to find this family. Okay, there they are at the bottom. We have H. Helfers and Mina Matilda. Okay, so along this first column, it will have a street name, if there was one, and then the house number. So sometimes your ancestor, if they lived in a city, you can take that information and you can look up if that street and house number is still standing, and you can see where your ancestor lived. Okay, this one doesn't have a street number or a house number, so it must have lived rurally. Okay, so we have H. Helfers, Amina, and Matilda. You can see, you can always look at the headings up here at what they stand for. So we have race, sex, we have relation to the head of the household, we have the date of birth, so we have their month and year. That's super helpful. We have the age at their last birthday. We have, let's see, whether they're single, married, widowed, or divorced, the number of years they've been married, the mother of how many children, and how many children are now living. You know, the place of birth of this person, place of birth of their father and of their mother, you know, their citizenship, the year of their immigration to the Hawaii Islands, the number of years in the Hawaii Islands. Then we can see if they're naturalized or not. And then we can also see their occupation and their education, if they can read, write, speak English, and if they can speak Hawaiian is on this one from Hawaii. Okay, so you can see that you can learn a lot of information just from that one census record. So here we have Henry Helfers, head, Caucasian, was his race, male, born January 1863. He's 37 years old. They've been married for 15 years. His wife, Mina, has had 3 children and 3 are still living. They were born in Germany. Parents were both born in Germany, immigrated in 1883. They've been in Hawaii for 18 years, and he is naturalized. You can see his occupation as an overseer, and he can read and write and read Hawaiian and English. Okay, so you can see there's lots of information in there. So now we know where he lived, we know some information about him, we know who's living with them. Then we can look for the next census. So you do the same thing, look for the 1910 census for your ancestor, and then start learning about them. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some ideas of how you can use census records to start making a timeline for your ancestors' lives. Census records, like I said, are relatively easy to locate in the United States and Canada and the UK. So start looking for those censuses, build out that timeline, and start learning about those ancestors. If you have any questions or want to learn more about how to look for records about your ancestors, you can get my online course, Know Your Family Tree, where I guide you through searching for census records and learning more about your ancestors. So thanks so much for watching today, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast today. If you could leave a rating and review, that would be great. This is how people can find the podcast and get more people to listen and to understand the power of knowing their ancestors. If you want to learn how to do this yourself, how to build your family tree, or how to learn the stories of your ancestors, you can go to knowyourancestors.co to find my 2 courses that are available to purchase. Know Your Family Tree takes you through understanding how to build your family tree and how to research it. This is the basis for how you can find information and stories about your ancestors. And then my more in-depth course, Know Your Ancestor, where you can learn how to look at records differently, how to find those pieces of information that tell your ancestor's story, to consider what trauma they might have experienced, what resilience they had in face of their challenges, and can help you really understand yourself in the process. So you can go check out both of those courses on my website, knowyourancestors.co.